This is Demetria Spinrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to Criminal Records Podcast, a podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history. And today, we have got a good old-fashioned heist. And when I say old, I mean the object in question is very, very old. It is also very heavy. It's 336 pounds, to be precise.
That seems like a tricky thing to pull a heist off. Also, what are you stealing at that point?
Well, what you're stealing, what the group of people in this particular case stole was a big block of sandstone. A big rectangular block of sandstone.
What, like, just for interior decorating purposes?
Well, this is a little bit more important a stone than your average piece of decor, which doesn't necessarily mean that it has been carved into any particularly unusual shapes. Someone at some point did carve some crosses on it. It's unclear if those are supposed to be Christian crosses or Roman numeral X's. There's also some handles sunk into the stone so it can be carried. But other than that, not really, I would say, the most elaborately carved bit of stone that you could use to decorate a house.
Yo, if you guys need some sandstone, I'm pretty sure the local, kitchen and cabinet realtor just has some.
This also happens to be yellow sandstone from Scotland, which does have a lot of sandstone to go around.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like this seems like not that big of an issue.
Oh, this is a big issue, sir. I am going to have to take you through a lot of history to explain why this stone was worth stealing. This is one of the most historically valuable and important pieces of a fairly average-looking gray rock in the entire world. And folks have probably guessed when I mentioned Scotland, I am talking about what most Americans know as the Stone of Scone. People in Scotland generally call it the Stone of Destiny. It's been in the news quite a lot this year, actually, because the coronation of King Charles required it to be brought down from Scotland. And I will explain why, because it is a much more buck-wild story than you could possibly imagine. And that's why, before I can get into the details of the actual heist of this stone, I am going to have to cover the history of explaining why it was so very important to steal the stone in the first place. And if you take the Scottish side, who stole the stone first?
You know, I'm pretty sure I found the Stone of Destiny as part of a quest in Final Fantasy IX, but sure.
So I apologize in advance for all of these Scottish Gaelic I am about to mispronounce. I apologize. I tend to butcher a lot of languages, but Gaelic is one that I really struggle with. So first off, we actually don't even know where this stone originally came from. If you want to go with the wildest version of the mythology, it was the pillow that Jacob was resting on when he had his vision of the angels at Bethlehem. Which I think pretty uncomfortable pillow, but he was a guy who wrestled angels. Maybe he was made of stronger stuff than me.
And this ended up in Scotland? A place famous for being a place that Jacob from the Bible went to.
People were carrying holy relics all over the place. Who knows?
Stop taking our shit, guys.
Some scholars believe that the biblical version was slapped onto some older pagan tradition, which definitely would not be uncommon in the area or really any area where Christianity spread. It is politic to let locals continue doing basically the ceremonies they were already doing, so long as they're praying to Jesus and not Odin or any other inconvenient pagan gods while they do so. If you want to go with a more grounded origin of where this stone came from, it could have just been a regular stone. It's possible that it was an altar stone left over by the Romans that was then picked up and repurposed by the locals after the Romans lost control of the area in the early 3rd century CE. This version of the story has the stone coming from the Antonine Wall, which was a turf and stone fortification north of the more famous Hadrian's Wall in Scotland. This ambitious attempt by the Romans to push further north was a pretty dismal failure. The locals were neither impressed nor stopped by the fortifications, which were abandoned pretty quickly by their builders and possibly picked over for good-looking stones by the locals.
Yeah, it seems a little more plausible than it being Jacob's pillow.
It is possible that this was just a bit of nice looking stone that somebody picked up while they were building a castle. Like I said, Scotland has a whole lot of sandstone, and even though actually a lot of studying this stone has been done, sandstone is sandstone. There are not a lot of surprises in sandstone at the molecular level, really. So what's important about this stone is not the composition of it or even really the origin of it, but how people have used this particular stone over the course of history, because it is one of several stones used in Europe as a coronation stone. There are quite a few different coronation stones around Europe. Sweden has the stones of Mora. There's an area that was part of Austria for a while, but connected to a Slovak ethnic group that used a bit of repurposed Roman column as a prince's stone. England actually does have its own coronation stone. There is a stone that 7 Anglo-Saxon kings were crowned on. Ireland also has something that they call the Stone of Destiny, or the Leafale. Again, I cannot pronounce Irish or Scots Gaelic very well at all. This stone, the Irish stone, is the one on which the High King of Ireland was crowned. The stone supposedly had some mystical properties, like roaring with joy if the true King of Ireland put his feet on it. Confusingly, both the Scottish and Irish stones, they're often called the Stone of Destiny and the Leafale. The Scottish stone also has a legend about the stone groaning when the true king puts his feet on it. There is a story about the Scottish stone at some point being transported over from Ireland. So it's a little unclear whether those two, because they had the same name and similar stories, sort of got conflated in oral history at some point, or if there's any truth to that. There certainly was a lot of, exchange between Scottish and Irish groups.
You think the stone is fundamentally anti-monarchist because it doesn't make any noise ever, proving that there are no true kings or masters?
Oh, sir, if you don't like the idea of a true king, the next bit of this story is going to be real rough on you. But I did want to say before I move on, how you can identify the Irish stone as different from the Scottish stone. The Irish stone is oblong instead of rectangular. It is upright, and it is politely described by scholars as phallus-like in shape.
And it prefers whiskey over scotch.
I don't know this period of history super well, but I think there were a lot of fertility rites tied up in ancient Irish kingship. So the king's rock-hard right to rule was pretty important for the country.
Yeah, so I did just hop on Google to take a look at the picture. It's shorter than I thought it would be, which I guess is not the first time that's been said about something phallic-like. But it does look like a giant dick. I do have to confirm that.
Look, some pagan rites you can slap a Christian coat of paint over pretty easily, but sometimes you just work Jesus in where you can around the screaming penis stone. We don't know how these stones were originally used in ceremonies. Some of these ceremonies are over 1,000, maybe even closing in on 2,000 years old, often performed by groups that didn't do a lot of writing. So we don't know the exact details of how the Scottish stone was used to crown a king beyond he definitely had to sit or stand on it at some point for the groaning to happen. So the Stone of Destiny is used as part of the crowning ceremonies of the Scots kings of Dalriada, a kingdom in what is now Western Scotland. The 36th king of Dalriada is a guy called Kenneth I, or Kenneth MacAlpin. Depending on which sources you're going with, Kenneth is either the guy who conquers the Picts, or he is himself a Pict who unifies the Scots and the Picts. What we do know is that he does unite these two groups into a kingdom called Alba, and he moves the stone to the village of Scone on the eastern side of Scotland around the middle of the 9th century CE.
And just for those of you who are not as up on your ethnic group history, the Picts, as I understand them, are either the ancestors of the modern Scots or a different ethnic group that lived in Scotland and merged with the Scots at some point. But we don't really know quite what their whole deal is, other than they were around during the Roman times, and then some stuff went down, and then they weren't.
They left some baffling carvings of things that look like dolphins, I think. They didn't do a lot of writing, but they left some very confusing carvings around. So yeah.
I mean, you gotta respect a whole culture that's built around trolling archaeologists.
So this stone stays in Scone for quite a while, encased in a chair that is used as the coronation chair of Alba and then Scotland. An abbey is built at Scone, and the area becomes a site for coronations and royal assemblies. The last king of Scotland to be crowned at Scone was John de Balliol in 1292. John was not a very good king, and he did not last very long, because Edward I of England has been getting pretty overbearing. He's essentially been treating Scotland like a vassal state. When John gets deposed by nobles who are not particularly happy about their weak king, Edward decides to retaliate by going ahead and invading Scotland. So when Edward invades Scotland, he makes sure to have the stone removed from Scone, along with some other holy relics, like a what people said was a piece of the true cross, the Holy Rood. So he carries that back to England, along with Scotland's other treasures. Just, that's what the English loved to do.
But he can't take our freedom! Is this a good point to plug the Patreon because of the episode we did on Braveheart?
Yeah, we had quite a lot to say about how bagpipes had not been invented yet in the time that Braveheart claims to cover.
We had a lot to say about freedom, because this is the leading into the Braveheart stuff, if you are familiar with that movie.
So, after a brief interregnum, a little war, and some peacemaking, there are once again Scottish kings who are not kings of England. When Robert the Bruce, again, you might know him from Braveheart, is crowned King of Scotland in 1306, the ceremony still happens in Scone, but the stone that he's supposed to sit on is absent because Edward's still hanging on to it. Edward decides that he is going to have a fancy new chair built around the stone that he's taken. That chair is kept in Westminster Abbey in London, which is the place where English kings are crowned. So he makes this chair look extremely English as he possibly can. He has ornamentation that is a painting of either himself or Edward the Confessor resting his feet on a lion. Just maximum, fuck you, the English have your stone on this chair.
I did just look this up, and it is quite a chair.
I will definitely put a picture of this in the show notes, because it is the most chair that you could possibly have. So Edward III of England makes peace with Scotland in the Treaty of Northampton, and this treaty includes the return of significant items, including the stone to Scotland. So that other holy relic I mentioned, the Holy Rood, does get returned, but apparently nobody gets around to lugging that big chunk of sandstone back up north. In 1399, Henry IV is crowned while sitting in the chair, and this begins a tradition of English monarchs incorporating the chair, and thus the stone inside it, into their own coronation ceremonies. So this becomes a very significant chair in English coronation ceremonies. This is the place where monarchs receive their regalia, which means it's where the actual crowning part of the coronation ceremony takes place. So the symbolic weight of this chair is incredibly important to England. The Scots are understandably not thrilled about their coronation stone becoming the object that the thieving English monarchs park their butts on to get crowned, but they can't really do much about it for a few hundred years.
Those dastardly English. I mean, I guess that it's a long tradition of the English monarchy, stealing things from other monarchies and saying, this is ours now.
Yeah, aren't there quite a lot of jewels in the crown jewels that have an iffy provenance too, right?
I believe many of them were quote-unquote borrowed from the Mughal rulers of India, among a few other places, the Kohinoor being one of the big examples.
Yeah, I actually, this was one of a quite long list of cases that I was considering doing about various relics from around the world that England happens to have. I might do one on the Elgin marbles later too.
Have. Has creatively reappropriated.
So, over the centuries, England and Scotland fight a whole lot of battles at the border. They're raiding each other, retaliating for raids, and so forth. Despite English attempts to take advantage of leadership crises, English forces failed to take Scotland And Scottish forces really don't have a realistic chance of marching all the way down to London just to get their stone back. They have a couple more pressing priorities. But then, England goes through a big leadership crisis of its own because Queen Elizabeth I does not produce an heir of her own, and she holds out for a very long time on naming anyone to succeed her. Finally, close to the end of her life, and after a lot of begging from her ministers, she makes a gesture indicating that she will allow her cousin James to be named as her heir. Here's the thing about James. James is already a king. He is King James VI of Scotland. He's actually been king since he's a baby because the Scottish leadership got a little wild. James had a pretty weird go of things. He has his poor leadership, I would say, has generated some of our more interesting cases, and he is a rich mine of content. Truly, he is.
Yeah, I mean, we've touched on your boy James a few times. Notorious promoter of hot babely guys, creating various scandals. Notorious raiser of a very stupid son who got himself decapitated. He hunted some witches, though, right?
He did hunt a lot of witches. He was so good at partying. I would say #1 English monarch I'd love to party with.
Ooh, you know what? I bet Victoria, she seems buttoned down. I bet she was a freak. It's always the quiet ones.
Wait, don't we have a bunch of diaries from Victoria about what a freak she was?
That wouldn't surprise me, but I honestly don't know.
Oh, she loved her husband. Anyway, we're getting off track here. So James. When James is crowned King of England in 1603, it was the first time that a Scottish king had been coronated on the stone since 1292. But he's not being coronated as King of Scotland in that ceremony. He's being coronated as King of England. Still, though, a Scottish king being crowned on the Scottish stone for the first time in centuries is considered a pretty big deal in Scotland, with some even saying that it's the fulfillment of a prophecy about the Scots ruling the land where the stone was placed. So, what James is really hoping for here is not a situation where he's the king of distinct countries, but a union of the crowns. So what he wants is for England and Scotland to become one kingdom with just one crown. So instead of this, you get coronated King of Scotland, then King of England, also King of Ireland, and also Wales has its own sort of vestigial monarchy. It's complicated. Just, roll them all up into one kingdom.
Some sort of united kingdom?
Interesting you should mention that, although it's actually going to be quite a while till we get to the UK.
It's foreshadowing. I'm foreshadowing.
But unfortunately for James, England and Scotland have a hard time burying hundreds of years of enmity just because of their new king-sharing arrangement. And like I said, James, not really the most politically adept monarch, so he has a hard time making this happen. But he does make some symbolic gestures for unity. He styles himself the King of Great Britain, and he combines the crosses of St. George and St. Andrew into the Union Jack flag that you recognize today as the, you've seen that. You've seen that everywhere.
The British flag.
Yes, but he does not manage to unify the crowns into one. Then things get even more tense with his son Charles I, who is originally just crowned in England in 1625, like Daddy wanted, but the Scots kick up a fuss about this because they still want their own coronation ceremony. So after 8 years of complaining about this from the Scots, Charles finally goes ahead and has a coronation ceremony in Scotland in 1633. Just to be clear about how the stone is fitting into this, Charles sits on the Scottish stone to be crowned King of England. Then he goes to Scotland and he is crowned King of Scotland without the Scottish stone.
So he does not take the stone with him, even though he does control it now.
As far as I was aware, I couldn't find any information about the stone being transported for this other ceremony. And that's not the only reason that this coronation pisses off the Scots, because Charles was big on Anglicanism, and he refuses to have a Catholic ceremony to keep his Scottish subjects happy. Charles was also big on bringing back the whole divine right of kings thing. He wants to make Scotland Anglican so he can fully control it as both the head of the church and the head of the state, which Scotland's not really down for. This doesn't make him very popular in Scotland, makes him a whole lot more unpopular in England, though, because he is beheaded by his own subjects in 1649.
Previous episode.
England takes a bit of a break from crowning monarchs after that, with Oliver Cromwell and later his son Richard serving as Lord Protectors, but Scotland does not take the same monarchy break. They declare Charles II as their king, and they go to war against Cromwell's forces. So, Charles II is the last Scottish monarch to be coronated at Scone in 1651, but without the Stone of Scone, because that stone is still stuck in a chair in England, which doesn't have a king. Simple, right?
I love monarchy. So great.
But wait, because where Charles II parks his butt to receive the crown is about to get even more complicated. Following the English Restoration, in 1661, Charles II is crowned King of England. So this is the ceremony that takes place on the Stone of Scone, which is not in Scone, where he was crowned a decade ago. Got that?
I love monarchy so much. You know what stones are really good for? Is dropping on monarchs.
So after Charles I, the monarchs of England, they just decide, you know what, this is getting really weird. We're just going to stop having separate Scottish coronation ceremonies. We're going to do the whole crowning you King of Scotland bit in London and call it good.
Yeah, I bet the Scottish love that.
What the Scottish love is about to get even more buck wild because James II is deposed as King of England. His son-in-law, William of Orange, is politely invited by English politicians to invade England, so William and Mary are jointly crowned monarchs in London, but Scottish rebels rise up unsuccessfully in support of James II. So who is the true king of England and Scotland? Getting a little bit complicated here.
And these would be the Jacobite rebellions, if you are familiar with them.
Yes. So England sticks with this whole 2-for-1 coronation deal ceremony. Actually, 3-for-1 if we count Ireland, which has sort of a weird relationship with the way the kings treat that monarchy.
Which, the Irish have not been asked about.
4 if you count Wales, which again is a weird little title that gets given to the heir in waiting. So it technically does have a royal structure as sort of like a just weird little ceremonial vestige.
It's a training wheels monarchy.
Yeah. So England and Scotland are still separate kingdoms with separate power structures. Scotland has its own parliament and is still, on some technical levels, an independent country from England until 1707, when the English and Scottish parliaments pass acts uniting to form the Kingdom of Great Britain, also known as creating what we call the United Kingdom today. So the Parliament of Great Britain is created at Westminster in London, and Scotland no longer has its own parliament. This has some benefits for both sides, actually, but mostly it is a safeguard against the Jacobites trying to bring James II's descendants back as rulers, because they are Catholic. And there are laws saying that the monarch of Great Britain cannot be Catholic. Now that Scotland is legally joined with England, the last monarch who is separately monarch of Scotland from monarch of England is Queen Anne, because every monarch coronated after that is coronated the king or queen of Great Britain, not specifically as the monarch of Scotland.
But all of the subsequent ones, their butts are still going in the chair with the stone.
Yes, they still have to put their butt in that chair to get the crown. However, the constituent nations of Great Britain and later the United Kingdom are still their own countries, even though they've been mushed into one sovereign state with one shared crown. So, does Scotland have a monarch? Yes, it does. Is that monarch coronated as King of Scotland? No, they're not, because the monarch of Scotland is the monarch of Great Britain. Where is that monarch coronated? On the ancient Scottish coronation stone, Where is that coronation stone? In England. Makes sense?
I love the system. So great. No notes.
You can see how this causes some tension in Scotland, especially because while the monarchs of Great Britain may rule Scotland, the South doesn't really have a history of treating the North, not even really the North of England, but in particularly Scotland, very well. And the majority of people who voted to end the Scottish Parliament were actually nobles with English ties. So the Scottish people feel like their representation was taken away by people who weren't really looking out for their best interests, and now they are being represented by people who really are not looking out for their best interests.
Well, yeah, but in their defense, in defense of those nobles, the only reason that these people think that is because it's true.
How very dare people think things that are true about the representation of their own countries? Even though Scotland's monarch is also the monarch of England, the Jacobites periodically rebel in the hopes of restoring Scotland's parliament and restoring the crown of Scotland to the descendants of James II. King George I squashes one of these rebellions in 1715. A second revolt in 1745 ends with crackdowns and a dismantling of the Scottish Highlands clan system to prevent future uprisings. This has really, I think, been romanticized actually a lot in American literature and TV shows. So even if you're American, you're probably a little bit familiar with sort of the end of the Highlander period.
And yeah, a lot of the imagery of Braveheart, if you're familiar with that movie, is actually more about this than it is what Scotland looked like during the medieval period.
Or if you watch the TV show Outlander, you have a somewhat more historically accurate understanding of what was actually happening, although there's some wacky time travel.
I thought you were going to say somewhat more horny understanding of what was actually happening.
So how does Scotland fare under this new system where they get way less autonomy in who is actually making decisions for the people? Well, actually, they do okay for themselves. Things do continue to be rough in Scotland for a while, particularly for young men who end up being displaced on the job market as the Industrial Revolution picks up figurative and literal steam in the late 1700s, and all those guys who are apprenticed for like really, really specific kinds of industries are now just completely having their jobs cleared out by less skilled labor. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like maybe something people can relate to today?
I don't know what you're talking about. This message has been brought to you by our fine friends at OpenAI.
But the Industrial Revolution does also mean that the Scottish textile industry takes off in a big way. Scotland actually does end up seeing some benefits from Britain's whole global imperial domination phase. And Scottish nationalism moves out of its violent uprising era into its, what I would call its passionately worded poems era.
Ah, yes, the true weapon.
The Scottish people do love a passionately worded poem, and they have produced some very famous ones. Politicians do occasionally kick around the idea of giving Scotland an independent parliament, so Prime Minister William Gladstone starts dangling the option of home rule via an independent but subordinate parliament in Ireland. It becomes a big political cause in Ireland and picks up some interest in Scotland as well. However, the Irish Free State actually decides to win its independence in war, and that happens in 1922. Scottish independence does not go down the same path. They go down more of maybe we'll eventually manage to elect somebody from the Scottish National Party to Parliament kind of path during the same time period. But the idea of Scotland gaining back its independence is building slowly but steadily. And the 1940s see a surge of interest in Scottish writers. One of those writers is a man named Compton Mackenzie. Mackenzie's a pretty fascinating guy in his own right. He served with British intelligence during World War I. He actually ended up creating a really good counterintelligence network in Athens, but he ended up getting turfed out of the country for his support of a controversial political faction that, among other things, wanted to recreate the Byzantine Empire.
Can I inquire as to why?
You know what? It was great while it lasted.
Okay, sure.
Hey, maybe Istanbul could be Constantinople.
Hey, that's nobody's business but the Turks.
So in the 1920s, Compton Mackenzie turns his attention to reviving a different and closer to home historical cause, and he helps found the Scottish National Party. He also writes a tremendous amount of both fiction and nonfiction. The nonfiction actually gets him in some hot water because he is a little too free with his details about what went down in British intelligence at the time that he was serving in it. But he is best remembered for his fiction set in Scotland. So he publishes the first book in his The Four Winds of Love series in 1944. It includes a plot in which Scottish nationalists plan to liberate the Stone of Destiny from England on St. Andrew's Day, of course, naturally, the most appropriate time to do it. And then these nationalists are planning to hide the stone from authorities by swapping it around between cars and then burying it to prevent the police from discovering it. In the book, a conspirator gets drunk and spills the beans, and so the plot never goes forward. It is foiled.
I mean, so their plan is to steal a rock and then bury that rock in the ground.
It's the perfect crime.
Yeah, you know what? Fair enough. I got nothing.
Part of the problem with trying to get the stone back for centuries and centuries was how do you transport an over 300-pound block of sandstone inconspicuously all the way from London to Scotland? The fact that cars are now an option really changes the game here.
Henry Ford doing great things for the cause of Scottish independence, and a few other things that we don't need to talk about.
So it might just be this fictional and foiled conspiracy that inspires some real-life Scottish nationalists to come up with their own plot to liberate the stone. So 1950 is kind of a weird year for the young and restless in Scotland. An earth-shattering world war is only recently in the past, and many young adults in Scotland either saw combat or were near to combat, or they certainly saw the results of combat on their own country. So they're starting to ponder the big questions of what they were fighting for, and specifically why politicians in post-war Britain don't seem to have the best interests of Scotland at heart. So a group of students at the University of Glasgow become interested in Scottish history and taken with the idea of restoring the Scottish national spirit. Having been a student myself, pretty normal pie-in-the-sky daydreaming for students. I would say when I was a student, we were dreaming about slightly different things than Scottish independence, but, students do like to get involved in politics.
All of these conversations were had in a very rational way with no booze in the room at all.
Oh my God, I read an entire memoir of one of these students to get some information. There is so much booze. So in 1950, having seen the growing popularity of the Scottish Covenant movement and the failures of the British government to respond to the post-war needs of the Scottish populace, these students start talking about what they can do to further the cause of Scottish self-government. I say self-government and not separation, because fully breaking away from the UK is not what the students are aiming for. What they wanted is a British federation, with Scotland having its own parliament instead of minority representation within the British system. These students reject the idea of violent resistance or sabotaging infrastructure, even though it actually would be quite easy to do that. Scotland is supplying a whole lot in the way of electricity and other essentials to England. But one student, Ian Hamilton, thinks that stealing back the stone that had been stolen from Scotland is the perfect symbolic gesture that will get people really thinking about Scottish nationalism. So in September 1950, Hamilton visits Westminster Abbey in London, and he sort of looks around the place and he thinks, you know what? It might just be possible to make off with the stone, but he needs a more concrete plan. So Hamilton is actually the one who wrote this memoir, so I have his word for it, what happened next. He's certainly a very interesting storyteller. I'm not always 100% sure that he's telling the full truth. He claims in his book that he got financing for repeat trips to London from a local businessman. But then he also says that when he asked this businessman for financing, the businessman reveals that by coincidence, he was also involved in a plot to steal the stone that went down exactly like the scheme in The Four Winds of Love, down to the part where somebody gets drunk and spills the beans and spoils everything. I don't know if Hamilton was trying to hide the fact that he actually got his idea from a book. If he did, he didn't hide it very successfully because Compton Mackenzie actually wrote the foreword to his memoir. It's possible that this businessman happened to know Mackenzie and was involved in a real event that inspired the fictional version. The Scottish Nationalist Network was not large at the time. If this guy's real, they probably did know each other.
Huh. Well, I mean, I guess there are worse places to get an idea.
So Hamilton takes another trip to London in November to case the joint again, and he thinks that he can remove the stone without damaging the chair that it's set in. While he is about to break the law, he actually doesn't consider himself someone who is being disloyal to the British monarchy by doing so. He actually says in his memoir that he felt he owed loyalty to the king who had been crowned in that chair, which at the time would be George VI. He also finds another local businessman who happens to know where he can find a replica of the stone, which allows him and a friend to practice hauling the stone away. Play some montage music here because it is time to plan the actual heist. Hamilton is going to walk into Westminster Abbey like an ordinary tourist. Then he is going to hide in the Confessor's Chapel, which is currently closed for repair. In the early hours of the morning, after the building's been locked up and everyone has gone home, he will screw the lock off a door from the inside, letting one of his friends in. The two of them are going to take an iron bar. They're going to run it through those two carrying handles in the stone. They're going to use that to hoist and transport the stone over to a small and inconspicuous car. That car is then going to drive to another location. They're going to transfer the stone over into a different car, which is going to head to Dartmoor, a moorland area in southwest England, to hide the stone. What's with the smaller car? Hamilton plans to have the smaller car drive not to Scotland, but to Wales. So if the police end up in pursuit, he can claim that the stone was stolen by Welsh nationalists, causing the police to waste their time chasing down leads in Wales, while the stone is actually still hidden in England and can be transported back to Scotland at a later date.
It's not going to take long for the police to work through all, 5 or 6 Welsh nationalists.
It's not going to take the police long to go, why would Welsh nationalists want to steal the stone of destiny that belongs to Scotland?
Those Welshmen, they just play a lot of rugby. I don't really know that much about Wales.
You are trying so hard to come up with a Welsh stereotype right now, sir.
They just have a lot of consonants.
So this is going to be more than a one-man operation. So it's time to assemble a heist team. Hamilton wants to do this over Christmas, but the friend who had been helping him up till now begs off because he has too many Christmas parties to attend. These are students, after all. They have their priorities. Hamilton briefly considers using a baby buggy to try to steal the stone all by himself, but at a party, he happens to chat up a domestic science teacher named Kay Matheson, who not only shares his political beliefs and his enthusiasm for taking back the stone, but who actually has a much better head than he does for making practical plans. And he admits this in his memoir, that Matheson is the much better planner of the two of them. He also is quite effusive about how beautiful Matheson is. He goes into great detail about how pretty she is and how surely a pretty girl will not be suspected by the cops. With Matheson's help, they recruit another student named Gavin Vernon. And then, on the day that they're supposed to drive down to London, they found out that Vernon had invited another one of his friends named Alan Stewart along for the heist. And Stewart was like, you know what? Hell yeah, sign me up for this heist. Just casually shows up to the heist with everyone else.
I love that they're just casually inviting people to their heist and someone begged out because they have too many parties to go to. This seems like a real well-run operation.
Well, the heist team road trips down in two Ford Anglias, one of which they have, I believe, borrowed from Vernon. I think it was one of their parents, I think, and the other one is rented. They take another trip to scope out the Abbey and get some dinner, and then Hamilton returns and he hides under a cleaner's trolley to try to wait it out until the building is closed. But not long after closing, he is caught by a night watchman. The plan has gone wrong. But Hamilton pretends that he got stuck in the Abbey after the doors were locked. The night watchman actually helpfully lets him out and tries to direct him to a nearby homeless shelter. But Hamilton has not given up. The next day is Christmas Eve, and it is time to try again. This time they are approached by the Archdeacon, who mistakes their interest in the layout for historical curiosity and gives them a tour of the place. While he's giving them this tour, he happens to drop some information about when the night watchman's shift ends. So they return the next night with a better understanding of when the watchmen actually make their rounds. So they come back to the building at 2 a.m. They actually get hassled by a policeman who sees them hanging around suspiciously, but thinks that they are a gang of car thieves, not a gang of students trying to steal a historic artifact.
To be fair, one of those is much more probable than the other, I think.
So this time, they do successfully get into the building using burglars' tools to break in from the outside through a door that leads into the Poet's Corner. They successfully pry the stone out of the chair, doing some damage, but not completely destroying the chair, just doing some minor damage in the process. They get ready to move it. One of them grabs the stone by one side, preparing to pull it along on a coat, and he rips it clean in half.
Ah, yes, that's why you don't invite the Incredible Hulk along on your heists.
There is something that these students don't know about the Stone of Destiny. This isn't the first time that someone has tried to use it in a protest. In 1914, a suffragette set off a bomb that damaged the coronation chair. That blast might have also damaged the stone, but the damage wasn't obvious while the stone was still inside the chair, and there was no public reporting about there being any cracks in the stone. So now, instead of transporting one very heavy stone, they need to transport two chunks of actually still quite heavy stone. And they are freaking out about whether they've accidentally cursed Scotland by breaking the ancient sacred coronation stone they were trying to return to its ancestral land.
You know who the real legend of this is the suffragette who fucking blew that thing in half. What a hero. Standing up for the cause.
We should do more suffragette cases because they're pretty hardcore.
Yeah, people think the suffragette movement was like just women standing around quietly picketing. It was not.
So the students managed to get one bit of the stone into the car. While Stuart and Vernon are dragging the other along on Hamilton's coat, another policeman stops by the car that Kay and Hamilton are waiting inside. So the two quick-thinking students pretend that they are busy making out to deter suspicion.
Brilliant. No notes.
The policeman makes some, talk with these students, asking, what are you doing in town? But doesn't seem too suspicious. But they are forced to drive off, leaving Stuart and Vernon behind. So they go back to where the other car that they had provided was parked. Because remember, they had to road trip down in two cars, and they had this sort of weird two-car system planned. Kay drops Hamilton back at the other car, and then drives off with the bit of stone that she does have in her car. Hamilton can't start the car he was just dropped off at because he left his keys in his coat, which Stuart and Vernon were using to drag the stone.
Oh my God.
Stuart and Vernon have dropped the stone and disappeared to avoid the police. So Hamilton has to go back to the Abbey. He has to search for the keys that have fallen out of his coat and actually got a little bit run over by the stone while they were dragging it. He has to run back to the car to start it. Then he has to drive back to the Abbey, and by himself, he has to load the rest of the stone into the other car.
It's a real testament to city life that presumably even early in the morning there are people around and they just see this giant rock and they're like, eh.
It's also Christmas Eve, so there's probably some weird shit going down on the streets of London. Everyone's probably very drunk.
Okay, you know what? That explains it.
By coincidence, Hamilton then drives past Stuart and Vernon, who had been wandering around lost in London. The stone is actually so heavy that Hamilton is afraid that he won't be able to drive the car if they all pile into it. Only Stuart gets inside the car, and Vernon has to make plans to meet up with the group later. Hamilton and Stuart drive out of London, and they hide the big piece of the stone in a stand of trees in Kent. Matheson leaves her car, which is the hiding spot for the smaller piece of the stone, with a friend in Birmingham. So figuring out how to get out of town on Christmas Day without cash proves to be a challenge for an, by this point, extremely sleep-deprived group of students. But our heist team does manage to make it safely home to Scotland. Remember, the pieces of the stone are still back in England, so they do still at some point have to go down and retrieve the stone. And this is a problem because the theft of the stone is an immediate media sensation and a major concern for law enforcement. It's not really a secret who would want this stone back. Officials closed the border between England and Scotland for the first time in 400 years. They don't close any borders between England and Wales. Not so successful in pinning that one on the Welsh
nationalists. I'm shocked that didn't work on those damn... God, the only things I know about Wales come from Torchwood, which I don't think is very helpful.
Reach for it.
What, those damn bisexual alien hunters?
So the police at this time are assuming that whoever stole the stone wants to get it back to Scotland as quickly as possible. They aren't really considering that whoever stole it would hide it in England. When they do start searching in England, they focus on dredging rivers in London, not the hiding spots outside of London that the students actually chose. So while the police conduct their search, our four Scots are... well, they're not completely innocuous, but they have managed to go mostly undetected by spreading rumors about how ridiculous it would be if Ian Hamilton was the guy who stole the stone. So Ian Hamilton is so well known for constantly talking about Scottish nationalism that they just had to go around being like, it would be so ridiculous if he was involved. He couldn't possibly be involved.
And that works?
It works. I mean, most of the people who know that he's this passionate nationalist are other students who are themselves passionate nationalists, so it works okay. Some fellow students, and even some reporters who happen to know Hamilton in Glasgow, suspect that maybe this guy and some other known nationalists in town were involved. But the disappearance of the stone is causing quite a bit of patriotic fervor in Scotland. Who is going to narc on some well-liked students who pulled off such a daring deed? Local reporters in Scotland even are struggling to come up with people willing to go on record to condemn the theft. Hamilton even claims that he was invited along to a taping of one of these interviews in which one of his fellow nationalists had to pretend to argue the other side because they couldn't find anyone who in all of Glasgow who believed that the stone should have stayed in England. But there's a big concern that the students have about the stone. It's the middle of winter, they left it outside, and limestone that's been kept in a dry environment can suck up water that turns to ice and expands. So they can't just leave the big piece outdoors until the heat dies down. They have to get it back to Scotland and repair it as soon as possible. So Hamilton, Stuart, and a couple other friends return south in yet another borrowed car to retrieve the stone. It's so big that they actually have to remove one of the car seats and send one of the group back by train, carrying the car seat with them.
And that, I mean, I guess, you know what? Just another day in public transit.
I mean, it's not illegal to carry a car seat with you on a train.
I suppose not. Not, you know, that's what freedom's all about.
The police actually do question these students. They're pretty much working down lists of known Scottish nationalists. These guys are very well-known Scottish nationalists, but they actually decide that they're innocent. So now the students have a new problem. The Scottish press is in their favor for the time being. But if they fail to produce the stone, or worse, if they produce a broken stone, they are not going to come off well in the press. Fortunately, the guy who found them that replica stone to practice with, the reason that he was able to find that is that he is actually both a Scottish politician and a stonemason. So they take the pieces of the stone to him, and he fixes the stone by driving a brass rod through it. Supposedly, there's a slip of paper with something written on the inside of that brass rod. No one, as far as I could tell, has ever said what is written on that paper.
I would assume it's fuck the English.
I mean, I assume it was something along those lines. So now that they have the mended stone, it is time to tip the police off. The students believe that if they do this, the authorities will let the stone remain in Scotland. So they put it on the high altar at Arbroath Abbey, which is a symbolic spot chosen because this is where the assertion of Scottish nationhood was made in a 1320 declaration. They then send a message anonymously to police, tipping them off about the stone's return. But they were incorrect about what authorities would do with the stone. Authorities transport that stone back to England. And under further questioning by police, Matheson, Vernon, and Stewart eventually do confess their involvement. But by this point, it is not a great political look for English politicians to bring the full force of the law down on a bunch of lovable, nerdy students who are, at this point, wildly popular in Scotland. So even though politicians do agree these students committed a crime when they removed the stone and vandalized the chair, they do not go forward with any kind of prosecution. The stone remained in England for decades, but political tides were turning. Scottish nationalism kept growing in popularity, and the stone's absence remained a symbol of Scottish discontent with the way that they were being treated under the UK's legal system. So, in 1996, the stone was officially returned to Scotland. And 3 years later, Scottish devolution was a reality. The Scottish Parliament met for the first time since 1707. But, like I said, the reason that I heard about the story in the first place is because the stone did have to make a trip back down south this year, because King Charles III still needed to be coronated on it, because the rules about how English coronation ceremonies work have not been updated. And because Charles is the King of the United Kingdom, yes, that does make him the King of Scotland. And yes, he is a direct descendant of James I through James's granddaughter Sophia. So unless you are still a believer in the Jacobite cause, he is the true King of Scotland.
But did the stone make a noise when his butt was on it?
As far as I'm aware, no.
Oh, what does that say?
Well, I did find a rumor that it was actually the replica stone that was returned to England, and the true stone, the real stone of destiny, the one that was broken and mended, is actually hanging out in a pub in Scotland. That may have just been some guy's promotion for his pub that he managed to get into the press.
I don't know about that one, buddy. I mean, look, I gotta say, sometimes you gotta let these things go. Like, speaking from my perspective as a Jew here, like, we all know the Pope has the original menorah in his basement in the Vatican. We know that. We know it's where it is. But after, like, a couple centuries, you do gotta have to just let this stuff go, guys. You gotta move on.
Says the guy who won't stop telling me the joke about how we still don't eat bread for a week because of Ramses the second and how we're mad at him. I don't think you should be lecturing anybody about letting anything go in history.
I mean, I'm not saying it's healthy. Nobody likes matzah. That stuff makes you constipated. Anyway, we're getting a little too niche for the Gentiles here.
But I mean, you do raise a really interesting point about the symbolism of national identity. And this is actually something that is, it's relevant to the way Scots think of themselves today. The Scottish independence movement actually only very narrowly failed a vote in 2014. And things have changed a bit since 2014. I will say, actually, if the Scottish independence movement succeeds, they actually do have a plan. They are going to keep the monarchy, which means that the entire system of bringing the stone back to England for the coronation has to continue, even if Scottish independence succeeds.
So they would go back to being two different countries if the SNP or other Scottish nationalist movements succeed, and there's another referendum that ends in Scottish independence, but you'd still have, I guess, currently Charlie III as the king of both countries.
Yeah, he would still be like a king sharing agreement.
You know, given the record of Charles I and Charles II, I would have picked a different name personally, just to put that out there too.
Yeah, what was going on with Liz that she was like, this is the one who's going to turn the name Charles around?
That's the one
us.
That's the one I want to call back to.
So yeah, that is the story of a crime that everyone agrees was a crime, but was never prosecuted, and the centuries and centuries and centuries of history that led up to that crime.
I mean, you know, I'm happy for those Scottish nationalists, and also I think this sets a great precedent, and legally this is not advice, for, say, any Greek nationalists or Indian nationalists. That I'm just saying, there's a precedent now for how they'll treat you.
I don't think the Elgin marbles are going to fit in the trunk of somebody's car, dude.
You know, get a Cybertruck. I'm sure you can fit them in there.
I mean, cars have gotten a little bit bigger since the 1950s, but I don't think you're going to get all the Elgin marbles in one SUV,
well,
man.
You just need a couple of drunk college students, and I'm sure they'll think of something. Yeah, I mean, I like to crack a few jokes, but it is pretty messed up, the kind of long-standing English tradition of saying you can't steal that, we stole it first. And certainly the treatment of Scottish nationalism has not been great, which is, I think, part of the reason the Scottish nationalist movement endured for 3 centuries. Yeah, I don't know. All monarchy is poison, though. And it's just a stone. And it makes no noise because there are no true kings.
Wow, dude, you managed to piss everybody off.
I'm just, you know, I'm really salty about monarchy as a concept because I still don't have an invitation to a state dinner from Naruhito yet. I keep asking. I don't hear anything from the Imperial Palace. Invite me. It'll be great. I bring my own entertainment. Put me in a state dinner with Xi Jinping. You don't have to do anything. You'll have, yeah. It'll be great fun for all concerned.
All right, should we end it there?
Yeah, I think on that note, if any of our beloved patrons want to reach out to us and I guess suggest other shows for us to watch so I can learn more Welsh stereotypes, where can they find us?
You can find us at facingbackward.com.
You can also find us at Blue Sky. We are Facing Backward on Blue Sky.
And we're Facing Backward on Tumblr, although I mostly accidentally reblog things from my personal Tumblr account onto that, and then realize that I've done so and have to delete that.
You might want to turn those off for a couple weeks as the Scottish nationalists and monarchists all come for us. We are also on Patreon at patreon.com/facingbackward. And we are very grateful to everyone who chooses to support us as we make very tasteless jokes about priceless historical relics, especially those of you who have donated our shout-out tier. And you are Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, Harrison Reese, Robbie Martin McAvoy, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fisheye Catch Our Rhodes Scholars compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked.
Until next time, think about what you can steal from the English.